Good morning. My name is, as you just learned, is Gary Kaplan. I am the Vice President in charge of Medical Affairs Research for Clinical Score. Yesterday, after the first panel discussion, I was able to catch up and speak with Heidi Lamb, and she talked about feeling like a fish out of water because she was an attorney. And I told her I know exactly how she feels because while my mother probably wished I had gone to med school, my background is applied stat and experimental design. So I'm not a doctor. I've been in research for a long, long time. I may look very, very young, but I really have been in research for about 40 years. In various capacities, senior analyst, chief statistician, account executive. I've done work in many different sectors from pharmaceutical on the commercial side to IBM and FedEx. I even, through the 80s, worked for a company that did all the ABC Washington Post news polls. So I worked in political polling and helped with exit polls. It's been a varied career, and I find it beneficial that I can take the learning that I've learned in various sectors and use it to help medical affairs teams assess, to help medical affairs teams understand how they're being assessed by KOLs. We at Clinical Score have three main areas. One is involved in clinical trial research. One is involved in interviewing subjects from clinical trials, and the third being medical affairs. So today I am going to discuss a little bit about some of the pitfalls we've encountered in our endeavor to be able to create ultimately a KPI within medical affairs groups, but where we've actually been able to have some tremendous success. And not having any real experience in medical affairs, I tend to read a lot about medical affairs and try to learn from the folks I've spoken to. One of the articles I found fascinating was from Pharma Voice a couple of months ago, talking about how best to maximize the influence of MSLs. And the four folks who were quoted, two of whom I've had the benefit to actually work with, Dr. Dyer and Dr. Krause, they talked about four things that were key: training, communications and relationship building, better listening, and of course being able to have the MSLs react to what the thought leaders' needs are. And so in my view of the world, I see this as this type of paradigm where a company sets up their internal objectives, what their MSLs are able to do, what they're not able to do. You train your MSLs, you send your MSLs out to speak with KOLs. They try to create relationships and communicate with them, hear what the KOLs have to say, and then of course report back, and the process begins all over again. Me and my somewhat research view of the world, I see a couple of problems with this approach in and of itself. One is that the initial training doesn't take into consideration anything about the KOLs other than what you're learning from people like Vox. I found their presentation fantastic yesterday in terms of being able to identify who really are the thought leaders in a given therapeutic area, but you don't really know too much about the individual KOL. And the second is that the feedback you're getting from the KOLs themselves are influenced by the MSL. And while I don't want to denigrate MSLs, they have their own biases in terms of what they're trying to accomplish. So what they're hearing from KOLs is not necessarily objective. So being the researcher I am, I assume that the best way to find out what a KOL wants and needs is through primary research and to obtain honest and objective feedback from the KOL. I'm not going to bore you with, I guess this will be one of the few slides that really is a research sort of geek slide. We use a double-blind approach, which means that the KOL doesn't know who our sponsor is, and we will promise the KOL anonymity so that we will never provide his or her name back to our client with their information. We offer them a fair market value on our area. We try to address globalization. We do this work globally in different countries, different regions of the world, and we're very cognizant of the differences throughout the world. The methodology we use for Recruit is heavily based on the type of KOL. Every KOL list that I've ever seen has been segmented into different tiers. You have the tier 1, the most important KOLs for a company, followed by a list of quote-unquote less important key opinion leaders. So usually the most important of these KOLs, we use a telephone recruit approach because these lists are fairly small, 20, 25, 30 people. And so we want to maximize our response rates. We want to get as many people to actually respond to our surveys as possible. Ultimately, we use a validated survey document. And what that means is sort of following up on what Lisa was talking about yesterday. We do use a multi-mode approach. We use qualitative research. We do a fair amount of in-depth interviews. We do focus groups. And we do quantitative surveys. So what we end up with is a survey that really does represent any given therapeutic area that we're in. That being said, we started the process to identify those categories that KOLs are using to try to assess the MSL. And we went through a series of interviews on our own dime, basically, and we found 8 basic categories of types of information that the KOLs are using. One is the basic method, the basic medical and scientific information provided. What kind of resource does the MSL provide? Is the data relevant? Is it unbiased? How knowledgeable is the MSL about the KOL's specific therapeutic area, about the market in general, the upcoming changes and advances in treatment area? Does the MSL provide any sort of information on completed clinical trials that can help the KOL? Are they advocates for the KOL in terms of getting them into clinical trials? Are they advocates for other program support, things like advisory boards and speaker programs? Does the MSL provide information back to me as a KOL when I need it? So if I'm involved in a speaker program and I need information that I know the MSL can provide, does the MSL provide that information? And then, of course, there's always the courtesy attributes, the accessibility, the responsiveness, the respect of my time, which is generally overlooked for the most part, and the ability for the MSL to be able to present him or herself, to be able to impart whatever knowledge or wisdom. How well are they able to do that? So from these 8 main categories, we're able to create anywhere from about 12 to 15 actual attributes that represent each of these. And we have a list of issues that we have created that represent each of these categories. So the first step that we went through is to find out how important are each of these categories to the KOLs. And we did what's called a MaxDiff, which is a terrific technique we've used many, many times. I've used over the years. And what we found out is that, not surprisingly, the most important attributes are the science attributes and the ability to provide the information unbiased, and then the knowledge base of the MSL, and then a little bit farther down From a tertiary standpoint, you're dealing with the program support, clinical trials and speaker programs, et cetera. And again, not surprising, of minimal importance are the ability to present, how well the MSL knows the portfolio of their companies and their primary competitors' product line, and then the courtesy attributes. So we took this information and we started to do program surveys for clients. Now, I don't have any slides for that because it really wasn't the thrust of the presentation, but I'll sort of just describe what we do. We'll contract with a company with a specific therapeutic area, medical affairs group. We speak with their medical affairs directors, fully understand their objectives. We get their total list of MSLs from them. We'll do maybe 10 or 15 in-depth interviews to make certain that the attributes that we've developed work basically for the KOLs in their specific therapeutic or subtherapeutic area. And then we conduct a quantitative survey. It's about 10-15 minutes in length. We start out the survey asking them what companies' MSLs they see on a regular basis. We generally find maybe they see anywhere from 12 to 15. In some therapeutic areas it's higher, in some it's lower, but it's about 12 to 15. We then tell the respondent that we're going to select 2 randomly for them to rate for the remainder of the survey. Now, the 2 that we select aren't really random. One is always our clients' MSLs. And I might add, it's surprising, they're sending us a list of KOLs. We generally find 10 to 15% in every study we've done where the respondent doesn't remember ever seeing an MSL from that company. So we always select our company's MSLs, and we always select one of 4 or 5 of their primary competitors, because they tell us who their primary competitors are, so that when ultimately we're comparing them, we want to compare them apples to apples with the people that they most want to be compared to. We go through a series of questions. How does the company A's MSLs measure on value on a 10-point scale, where 10 is maximum value and 1 is no value at all? It starts to get involved in maybe creating some sort of pseudo KPI. And then we go through each of the categories, and we have the KOL rate that company's MSLs on each of these 12 to 15 categories. Their medical knowledge, their unbiased approach to providing information, et cetera. If it's a 10-point scale, and if they rate an MSL 7 or less, we then show them a list of those issues that relate to the category so that we can understand specifically where the MSL may need some additional help. It helps our client in terms of being able to train the MSLs for future interactions. We can also then use this information to compare the results to their primary competitors. Now, it all seemed logical, and our clients really loved the data. But being researchers, we spent a lot of time looking at the data, and we did this, we did at least 50 studies in different therapeutic areas for different clients. And those of us who were involved in the analytics, we noticed that the data itself, there was always data that didn't match up with what we were trying to present. So we naturally started to think of what we can do to figure out what we missed. I mean, as I said, the advantage of not being in medical affairs and just in being research is that I have the ability to bring possible techniques that you guys may never have used before. The disadvantage is that not every technique that I've used for a sector may work in medical affairs. So we started to discuss what some of the problems may be. And we started to think through what the differences are in terms of what the goals of a product or a marketing manager in terms of getting results like this versus a medical affairs manager. Clearly, a marketing or manager or a product manager is interested in gearing their product or their message to the majority view. those issues that are most important. In this case, it would be medical, it would be the unbiased information presented and being presented to the KOL. But medical affairs managers have a different need. They're dealing with a series of interactions with individual KOLs. And some of the data that we were finding didn't match up with the MaxDiff. It didn't match up with what seemingly was the most important aspects. It did not. So we started to try to figure out what we could do to explain those results that were unexplainable. And so what we did is we went back to the proverbial drawing board, and we started to contact, we got permission from our clients to simply go back to the totality of all of the KOLs for whom we had received lists. This was across company and across therapeutic area, and went back and simply asked one series of questions. On a 100-point scale, how relevant are each of the categories to you? Not unlike the MaxDiff, but slightly different. And what we found, first off, gratefully, that the totality of the results matched the MaxDiff, because I don't know what we would have done if it hadn't, but it did. Those issues that were seemingly important in the first go-round were also important here. But one of the advantages of using this technique is that we were able to create need states where we could put individual KOLs into specific need states. So what I'm going to show you here is a fairly simple example of what we're able to provide. Here I have actually combined the categories on the y-axis, what's called science and medical knowledge. This would be the science, this would be the knowledge of the MSL, this would be the relevance of the information and the unbiasedness of the information. The higher you are up in the scale, the more relevant that is to the KOL. On the x-axis are support programs. And here I've combined clinical trials and advisory boards and speaker programs. Here, to the extent that you're left on that scale, you find that most relevant. So the top left quadrant would be those KOLs for whom they're keenly interested in both. They need the consultancy and they need the program support. On the right quadrant are those who need the consultancy, but program support is not all that relevant. The lower left, of course, are just those folks that need the program support. We tend to find that box occupied a lot in the oncology area. These are folks who are generally working in fairly large academic institutions. They believe that they know more than the MSL knows about the science. So they're really not interested in hearing science, but what they want is advocacy for the support programs. And in some cases, in oncology, they want more than just being advocated for being a part of clinical trials. They actually want to co-author articles, and they want to actually have an active role in creating protocols. The lower right quadrant, you very rarely see anybody in. After all, these are key opinion leaders. You're not going to find too many for whom nothing is relevant, although you'd be surprised every once in a while you do find, we find clients whose lists are not fully updated, and you do find people that don't see MSLs at all, or they're just not interested in anything an MSL has to impart. That's very rare. What we find is, depending on the country we're in, depending on the therapeutic area we're measuring, the percentage of KOLs who fall into each of these quadrants is different. You can see maybe half of the KOLs want both. Maybe a quarter to a third only want the science consultancy. Close to a quarter only want the program support. But they are different animals. Not every KOL views the world the same way. And when you get into some therapeutic areas, these values can really drastically impact how they view your MSLs. Now, MSLs are being trained. They're all being trained in one area, and they all are going out trying to work with these KOLs 3 or 4 times a year, but the KOLs are all looking for something different. And what we found is that the results of the value ratings sort of mirror the specific need segment that they're in. Now, what I've done here, I've listed this as companies A, B, C, and D. These are actually real results. Company A doesn't always represent the same company. It's not always Pfizer or Sanofi or AstraZeneca. It's a composite of all of the work we've done in this field, but there is always a company A that matches this pattern, as there are companies B, C, and D. So these are actually real results. In this case, we're looking at a 10-point value rating, where 10 is maximum and 1 is very poor. And you can see that company A is on top of the market with an overall rating of 9. Company D is down in mediocrityville with an overall rating of 7.3. As we go through the individual quadrants, you see some changes. Now, in the first quadrant, that's pretty consistent with the overall. But when you get into the second quadrant, you see that company B, which has been which was in basically second place behind company A in terms of value, is now seen by those KOLs who only want the consultancy. They're now seen as the gold standard. And when you look into why that might be, we find that company B has a corporate directive that they don't want their MSLs getting involved in providing advocacy for programs. So it makes sense that in that segment where the KOLs don't want program support, their MSLs are seen as being tremendous in terms of consultancy. The other thing you take a look at is poor company D. Company D, which was mediocre at 7.3 overall, is now down at 5.3 in a segment where the respondents really don't want program support. Now you take a look at the ratings among KOLs who only want program support, and you see that company B that doesn't offer it is down in 5.9, but company D is elevated to a good, not great, good 8.2. Company A, of course, is very, very consistent. They do have a fairly decent program where they support KOL's needs in terms of programs. Company C is also very consistent, but they certainly are really lacking relative to Company A. But when you start to look at need segments, and you start to understand that creating a KPI, for one thing, in medical affairs is not as simple as just simply using one metric, because the metric that would be needed for each of these KOLs differs greatly by what the KOL's needs are. Now, this is a simple 2x2. You take a look at the data in terms of the needs of those people who are interested in support programs. And you can see that while clinical trials is clearly the overwhelming support program that is most needed, there are 20% of the KOLs, this is across the board, in all of the interviews we've done, who really want program support in either speaker programs or advisory boards and not clinical trials. And so when you start to look at the individual responses by need state relative to the corporate directives, you can see some very interesting results there. We do this across the board with almost all of the categories, trying to understand specific KOLs. Now, I haven't said much about the courtesy variables, because courtesy variables in terms of importance pale in comparison to a consultancy and advocating for clinical trials, etc. But it doesn't make it any less important. And so when I take a look at respect of my time, now respect of my time means a lot of different things. It's not always simply etiquette. It may mean that I'm looking for clinical trial support and you're not providing it, so you're not really respecting my time because you're showing up. But it also has to do with the way in which the MSL contacts the KOLs. We hear more times than not that an MSL will simply show up. Now that doesn't happen a lot with MDs, but there are companies who have PharmDs, NPs, and PAs on their KOL list, and they complain that the MSLs don't really have respect of their time because they just show up. It happens in some therapeutic areas where the KOLs may be part of a very large institution, and so the MSL may contact the most senior doctor at that institution, and while they're in an area, they just show up to see one of the other KOLs who may be in that same area. So it's a problem enough that the KOLs mention it. And as you can see, where the respect of my time decreases, the overall ratings of the MSL in areas that really have nothing to do with courtesy seem to decrease as well. It's a little bit less with regard to accessibility. How accessible is my KOL when I need to speak to my MSL, when I need to speak to him or her? And you can see that when they're not accessible, the overall rating of the MSL drops. Now, that has a whole lot of impact relative to the needs segments. Because if I'm a medical affairs manager and I want my MSLs to meet with a KOL 3-4 times a year, to the extent that they're wasting their time meeting with a KOL for whom they can't really help, because the corporation is not going to allow them to help the KOL involved with program support, that may impact their accessibility with those KOLs who really want to see them, because there's only so much time that an MSL has. And so these results have tremendous impact. So, what's the ultimate goal? Well, the ultimate goal is to try to classify KOL lists ahead of time, before the MSLs actually meet with them. And we have been fairly successful at being able to do that. There are a number of steps we take. One is we actually use survey research too. The second bullet really should be the first bullet, because it's the first thing that we do, and that is we conduct a fair amount of in-depth interviews with marketing affairs managers of individual companies. We want to understand what your objectives are in the marketplace and how you deal with KOLs. I mean, we can't really assess your MSLs without knowing what your objectives are. We want to know what your corporate objectives are, what your objectives are. We want to speak to a couple of the MSLs to get their take on the KOLs that they speak to on a regular basis. We have developed a way where we go and we speak to KOLs and we interview them to be able to classify about 25–30% of the KOLs into the proper need state. And we've been successful at that. The second thing we do is we've done a lot of work understanding the relationship between some of the more extraneous demographic, if you will, variables to the need states. I mean, the role of the KOL. Are they professors? Are they simply publishers? Are they in private practice? Are they in private practice and have a blog? That impacts, to a great extent, what need segment they fall in. The other thing is the KOL, their medical degree. Are they MDs? Are they DOs? PharmDs, NPs, PAs? the type of KOL, it all impacts where they fall in that need segment and enables us to help our clients try to understand what KOLs on their list have what needs. And the third area, of course, is we try to stalk them. I mean, there's tremendous information online that sounds really negative, but the Sunshine Act database is a tremendous way for us to identify whether or not KOLs are involved in trials, are involved in speaker programs and advisory boards, because all of the monies that have changed hands have to be notated. There are other online sources, LinkedIn, etc. So we use as much information as we can to try to pre-classify KOL lists for our clients. The implications of that, of course, is that it maximizes the influence that MSLs have over KOLs, because you can set up training programs knowing exactly what it is that you're about to face. It enables the MSL a better fighting chance to create a relationship with a KOL, because you know ahead of time what that person is really looking for. And it just makes it easier to react to KOL's needs, because you go in with a sense of what the KOL is looking for. Secondly, from a resource allocation standpoint, medical affairs managers have a better sense for how to allocate their MSL's time, because you know what MSL may not have to see a KOL more than a couple times a year, because you're not likely to be able to get them what they need simply because of corporate objectives. And this way you can spend more time seeing those KOLs who are most interested in seeing you. I was fascinated by, Moshe, by your presentation about using number of visits as one of the KPIs. And what fascinated me is that when we do these interviews, we may find that an MSL has seen a KOL 4 times a year, and then we're measuring 2 different companies. And in both cases, our client's MSL and our client's competitor's MSL sees a KOL the same 4 times. In one case, we may hear, we ask them how much time do you spend with the MSL, and they may say to us, we spend 45 minutes and it's not enough time. And then in the next MSL who's being rated, they say, we spend 2 minutes with them and that's too much time. So from a KPI standpoint, simply using the number of touches or number of visits is probably not sufficient, because it really depends on how much the KOL is getting out of the interaction with the MSL. And lastly, we can actually begin the process of trying to create a real KPI. Value works pretty well. What Dr. Levine Dahlberg started to talk about messages, that may work pretty well. We're in the process of trying to move from a process-based to more outcomes-based by using value, and messaging works, but we do have a group of former compliance people, because when we do come out with a KPI, we want to make sure that it will be accepted by the industry, by industry standards. But the one thing that we've learned in dealing with these need segments is that no matter what KPIs are developed, they really have to be geared to the need segments, the needs of the KOLs. One size really doesn't fit all. It's far more complex than that.